Okay, so today we have Alex Fox with us on our video podcast. Alex is a CEO of Shared Lives Plus UK, which is a network for shared lives and home share. So welcome, Alex.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on. I think it's quite useful for people who don't know you, who are new to Share Lives as well. If you could just give a bit of an intro of what you do in Shared Lives and what Shared Lives is.
Sure, and lots of people don't realise that they've almost certainly got a Shared Lives organisation in their local area,
Mm.
because there's one in almost every area of the UK now. So the way Shared Lives works, there are about 10,000 Shared Life carers, and they've all welcomed somebody who needs support into their own family home. So if you were recruited to become a Shared Life carer by your local scheme, they'd put you through a 3 to 6 month approval process to make sure that you're right for the role, that you want to do the role, and then they'd match you with an adult who needs support. So that might mean that somebody with a learning disability or mental ill health or dementia or another long-term support need would come and move in with you, live as part of your household or your family, or they come and visit you regularly. So to give a sense of what that's like, for Meg, who was spent a lot of time in hospital wards with very significant mental health problems in her early adult life and as a young person, she wanted to move into the community when she was well enough to leave hospital, but didn't necessarily have a community ready-made for her to go to. So she moved in with a shared life carer called Hayley, lived with Hayley for a while she was learning independent living skills, putting down roots, but and as she puts it, as Meg puts it, making friends, going on adventures, and getting work, and finding herself as a person, really, so that she could move into her own place, but not be on her own. She's got a network of friends and supporters around her. So Shared Lives is a really unusual combination in adult services of something that feels really personal to people. People choose who they're going to share their lives with.
Yeah.
They have a lot of autonomy to work out what good life looks like to them. But it is also part of a CQC regulated service in which people are trained and paid, and it's got all of that infrastructure around it.
That's really good, laying out what it is. Now, I don't know much about shared lives, but I do know a little bit about adult placement schemes because I grew up
Mm.
in an adult placement scheme. And back then, I mean, I was really young and my mum was a psychiatric nurse and we supported people in our home. And it really did feel like a home from home. I didn't know any different. We just had people with different abilities who lived with us and it was a lovely family atmosphere. Um, so I would just like to know what was the changeover from adult placement schemes to shared lives? When did that happen? And was it just a change of name or?
It is essentially a change of name. So it's the same model, but I think for it had been called adult placement for a long time, and people felt that they weren't in the business of placing adults somewhere. You know, it was about people choosing where they wanted to live, and so there was over 10 years ago now, there was a search for a name that felt like it was a better fit with how people felt. As you said, that home from home, that idea, it's just part of family life. But Shared Lives has been changing in lots of ways since it was first I wouldn't say invented because it's been around for as an idea for centuries, but it was reignited in the 70s in Liverpool by an organisation called PSS. And since then, obviously, it's gone through lots of changes. And a key one at the moment is that it's been developed as a health service. So it's been a social care service for a long time. But actually now it's something that people are starting to use in the health system. So for people with stroke or acquired brain injury, mental health problems, getting people out of hospitals or helping to ensure people don't need to go into hospital.
So how does that work then? Because presumably, if it's moving from social care to health, you'd need to be living with a family where somebody has some health expertise, or is it just bringing community health to them. So it's the same sort of thing, but
Yeah.
just, yeah, using
It
services
can it
differently.
can be both. So I mean, you said your mum was a psychiatric nurse, I think,
Yeah.
mental health nurse. So I've certainly come across people who've taken their nursing skills or other kind of medical qualifications into their shared lives role. So they feel, they're bringing that they're using those medical skills, but in a very social setting. For other people, although they're in the medical system, their needs may actually be social. So
Mm.
you see this with some people with learning disabilities who have become stranded in assessment and treatment units where they may have lots of labels around complexity and challenging behavior and so on. But with the right match and with people with the right skills, actually, they're people who are able to thrive and probably only, like most of us, able to thrive living in an ordinary home in an ordinary community.
And in terms of the operational side of it, how it actually is administered, if I wanted to get involved and do shared lives myself, how much support would I get? Would I have someone locally, a team member from Shared Lives? Is it like a franchise where you have local offices?
Yeah, so some people think it's a franchise, and in some ways it behaves a little bit like that. But actually, all of the organisations are independent, so nobody owns Shared Lives other than the care regulators, effectively, of the four home nations. So, but there is a lot of consistency across Shared Lives schemes. So, I work for an organisation called Shared Lives Plus, where the national membership body for shared life carers themselves, but also for all of the organisations who coordinate shared lives locally. And there are 150 of those now. So if you wanted to get involved in your local area, you'd approach your local shared life scheme,
Right.
and there's a process then that lasts for quite a long time. It's not a quick recruitment process. It is about getting to know each other, because the role, as you'll be aware, that you'll end up taking on is a very autonomous role, huge amount of personal responsibility. So you
Mm.
need to make sure you get the right people involved. And then once you have taken on that role, then there's the matching process. So that's key to a successful arrangement, that people have had the chance to get to know each other on their own terms, at their own speed, and really feel like they want to share their lives with each other.
Great. And in terms of support for people in training, do you feel that there is quite a lot of support for people out there? So, is it fair to sometimes compare it to fostering for adults? Because sometimes when I'm talking to people about it, I just an instant way of trying to help people understand it. That's how I talk about it. But is that fair? I know in fostering you do get a lot of training, safeguarding, and you have to write a lot of notes and keep a lot of records. And obviously, it's a regulated service, the shared life scheme. So, is it similar to that type of operation?
So we have quite a few shared life carers who were originally foster carers, sometimes because they're supporting somebody who's a child who has a disability and who needs support moving on into adulthood. And for that consistency, sometimes that person, as they move into adulthood, stays with that household, and it then becomes a shared lives arrangement. For others, they've just made that switch. So there are similarities in terms of how it's set up. Things like how it's paid and the tax arrangements and so on look quite similar. I think the differences are, obviously, this is about support for adults. So as an adult, we're not looking to be parented, but most of us don't dream of living alone. We want to be part of a supportive household. So there's a real focus on that independence. Shared lives is a way for people to live as independently as they possibly can in the community, with that support network around them. But when I talk to people involved in shared lives, they're taking on new activities, whether it's something as simple as learning to ride a bike, or
Mm.
getting an allotment, or volunteering for the first time, but also getting paid employment for the first time, going out and meeting a partner, and all of the different aspects of independent living. That for some people, having that that much more flexible support around you can be a real route into independence. And
Yeah.
I think the other thing that's really core, which I'm not sure is always happens as much within the fostering system, is matching. So the idea that both parties get to choose who they live with.
Yeah, I think that was listening to another podcast about it, and they were talking about the whole matching system, which I think is really, really good. And when hearing you talking about it, it also makes me think about the idea that it could be a way of revolutionizing the way that we support people. If you had more people who were willing to take on that responsibility and support people within their community, potentially you wouldn't need the institutions that we have at the moment, which some of them are doing great, some of them aren't doing so great. But the whole model is just, it starts with the family, it's within a family, and it's inherently within a community. I mean, that's everything that we talk about nowadays, is being in a community and doing things co-productively. And it seems like a really good model. But the only caveat, I suppose, is having people who are willing to take on that responsibility. But yeah, it does sound like something that could really help that. Have you got stories of examples of how it's changed people's lives?
So I'm thinking of, say, one of our ambassadors, James, who works with us at Shared Lives Plus, sort of talking about the model, but also helping us to shape it, and with things like local health checks. So James was living in an institutional service, an epilepsy centre, for about 20 years or so, and he moved out of there, and his route out was through moving in with Andy, a shared life carer. And Andy always says that although there were, James had lots of labels about his epilepsy, his learning disability, and so on. Really, when he asked him what he wanted, he said friends and a job.
Mm,
So they set about that. Friends and a job became their care plan for the next kind of couple of years, and so that was about James getting to know everybody in the community,
yeah.
drawing on Andy's family and friends network, being a part of Andy's busy household, but eventually actually moving around the corner into his own place, but still with that very strong connection between them, and support when he needs it. And they've actually set up a community interest company together, a social enterprise,
Mm,
which helps people understand and explore independent living, called Local Social. So you see people achieving things that they absolutely weren't expected to achieve. So when we've surveyed people about the health impact, for instance, lots of people talking about just becoming healthier, losing weight, giving up smoking, taking up exercise, which they maybe hadn't been encouraged to do, understanding healthy food, and learning to cook, and kind of having all of those benefits. But also sometimes some quite dramatic things around illnesses that were misdiagnosed, medication that they've been left on for years and years that they didn't actually need. And
mm,
um, it was only when their shared life carer got to know them perhaps better than anybody had done for a long time that they were able to try and unpick some of that, and then go and help them have a conversation with health professionals about what they really needed. So, and it's important to say as well that we don't think that shared lives is for everyone. So we'd like it to be offered to everybody as one of the choices. It's not a fit for everybody, um, but it does fill a really important gap. So you've got options around self-directed support, where you can take a direct payment, employ your own PA, and
mm.
that works brilliantly for some people. I think we are always going to need the more formal support services. We're going to need care homes. So this isn't a solution, but we need to be making sure that we're using those services in the right way, and for people for where that really is the need, not because we haven't found a community alternative.
Yeah. Um, and in terms of when you are a shared lives carer and you want to go away on holiday and you're supporting someone with quite high needs, are there support networks or respite, so that the carers can get some time by themselves?
So we recommend that shared life carers have about 28 days breaks each year,
Mm.
so that they have that time to themselves, and that there's the package of support needs to include arrangements for the individual to have support from someone else to enable that to happen. Of course, people do also go on holiday with the person they support as part of their role as well. So, one of the things that when we ask people what they did for the first time through moving into a shared lives household, they identified going on holiday as about half of them said they'd been on their first ever holiday. About half of them of those said they'd been on their first ever foreign holiday. So they
Ah,
got a passport for the first time and so on. And it's I've been talking about the people who live with their shared life carer.
mm.
So about half of the 14,000 people using it will live with their household. For the others, they visit regularly for short breaks. So somebody with dementia, for instance, who where their family and family carers were being offered short breaks in the form of overnight stays in a care home. People don't that doesn't necessarily work for everyone. So being able to visit a shared life carer that they share interests with, that's really in a really familiar environment, can
Yeah,
work really well as a short break.
that's a really good idea, actually. Sounds like it's very well thought out with people at the centre, which is great. Um, I want to get on to your book in a minute, but
Mm.
before we do that, I'd like to know a little bit more about you and how you came into shared lives and your. I'm always interested in how people come into care and then choose it as their or into the social care industry and choose it as their careers.
Yeah, so I was a care assistant in residential care homes at the beginning of my career,
Okay.
and then I really wanted to, at that point to start working with children and young people. So I volunteered as a childline counsellor, and I ended up doing a development role, helping to set up a young carers service for children who look after their parents in North Yorkshire,
Mm.
and then moved on to the national body that's now the Carers Trust, doing similar work. Um, and I worked for the Carers Trust for quite a few years, set up a policy department there. And then I just came across my predecessor, actually, Sian Lockwood, who played a pivotal role in establishing Shared Lives Plus and the sector as well. And she was telling stories about the work that our members do. And I'm ashamed to say I didn't. Well, and everybody says this when we talk about this model. People say I hadn't heard of this, and I was the same. I hadn't heard of it, and
Yeah.
I'd been working in the sector for a while, so I felt this was something that the sector needed. That was, as I said, it's filling a gap, but also showing some very different ways of forming really deep relationships, which I think are always at the heart of great social care. And although it was a very tiny organisation at the time, as Sean was moving on, I went for this job, and that was over 9 years ago now. So I've been here a little while, although I meet people who've been shared life carers for the last 40 years or so. So I'm
Yeah.
still a
Wow.
newcomer.
And then you felt compelled to write a book. I always think that people who are compelled to write a book have a lot to say about the subject. You have to. So the book is A New Health and Care System, Escaping the Invisible Asylum. That's a really interesting title. I've got to admit, normally before I interview people, I read their books, and I haven't got around to reading this one, but it's on my reading list. So you'll have to go back to basics with me on this one and just explain, firstly, why you felt compelled to write this book, and then what it's all about.
Well, let's hope I don't put you off it before you've read it. But I felt like I'd gone on a real journey from working in a more familiar model of care, and then working with family carers, hearing their experience of care and support, and then coming across this group of people who were living this very different approach to supporting people, and feeling that was a real culture shock. So um, here was a sector that just felt like it was doing some very fundamental things very differently to how I remember being trained in my first care roles, where I remember lots of training around professional boundaries, appropriateness, risk, lots of sort of technical systems stuff. And here I was meeting people who were saying, well, he or she's just part of the family and we love them. And
Right.
yeah, my kids taught him to ride a bike, and be thinking, well, you can't risk assess for that. Um, and and then seeing this work. So, you know, the Care Quality Commission says it's 98% good or outstanding. That's, you know, much
Wow,
better
that's
than the other
incredible.
form of regulated care. You know, there are things can go wrong, absolutely, and you know those risks do have to be managed, but they are manageable. And I was hearing about people achieving so much. So what I wanted to do in the book is sort of take people a little bit on that journey, and it's called the Escaping the Invisible Asylum, because I felt like I was suddenly starting to see aspects of our system which either I just hadn't seen before, or that are kind of hiding in plain sight, that we take for granted. So we like to think we've closed down the asylums, the
Yeah,
workhouses,
yeah,
you know, the big institutions. And we haven't closed all of them actually, but we do like to sort of think we have. And most of our services we tend to be describing as community-based services. But actually, though, that thinking which led us to build those asylums, I think, is still more deeply embedded in our whole care and support system across health, social care, and other public services than we like to imagine. So I wanted to try and bring that into visibility to show an example of things happening very differently, but then also to draw links between what we're doing here at Shared Lives Plus and this whole field of what are often called asset-based community approaches, and to try and ask the question, will these always need to be the exception to the rule, or could actually everything we do in public services, whether it's in a shared life scheme or in you know, the acute sector in a hospital, could they start to behave in these different ways? So I look at some of the things I think we're getting wrong, how we're creating risks, for instance, through some of the ways in which we try and manage risk, or how we are finding out more and more about how particular parts of the system work, but whilst other aspects of it remain mysterious to us. And then in the second half of the book, having looked at the shared lives example, I'm trying to think, what would it be like if we tried to build a new health and care system from the ground up around 2 or 3 really core principles and practices that I see an emerging field of services adopt.
that's really interesting. Can you go into those 2 or 3, or is it kind of a spoiler?
Sure. No. Spoilers are. I think. I mean, yeah. It's no spoilers. So the. I mean, what the models that I've been doing lots of work with, as we've sort of been talking with each other, but we're also part of a number of different partnerships, have in common is they're all asset based, which is a horrible jargon term, but
Yeah,
essentially just means they are looking for what people could or can do, not just for what people can't do, and then trying to help people build on their gifts, skills, assets, strengths. Um, so they're taking that asset-based approach. You know, co-production, which I know is kind of, you know, at the center of your work, they're recognizing that if the same group of people try to redesign services, they do tend to come up with slight variations on the same stuff.
right.
Actually, we need a much more diverse group of people who aren't just getting the chance to design their own care package, but actually are helping to redesign the system as a whole. So I think there's a strong
Brilliant.
degree of co-production in these models. And then they try and achieve a couple of different things. So one of the things they nearly all try to do is connect people with each other. So if you look at we also support a model called Home Share, which connects often an isolated or lonely older person who has a spare room with a younger person who needs somewhere to live. And you bring
Okay.
companionship, a bit of help. Everybody wins, and they talk about having this new relationship. Both parties will talk about that. Local area coordination is a model based on helping a different front door for care and support, in which you'd meet a local area coordinator who's embedded in your community and whose role is to find out what a good life looks like for you, not to try and signpost you into a particular service. So these models, and you can actually see them on the Think Local Act Personal website. So if
Yeah.
you go to there's something called the rainbow of innovative models there, and you'll spot it because it looks like a rainbow, and that's become a catalogue of a growing number of approaches and initiatives. So there's lots of them out there.
Yeah.
So they connect people with each other, and I think we can do. We can carry out all of our care and support work, wherever we're working, in ways which connect or disconnect people. So one of the things I suggest is, if we're going to develop this new health and care system, we need a set of goals which, broadly speaking, I describe as well-being, a good life. And then we need some ways of measuring whether we're having a positive or negative impact on well-being. And are we leaving people more confident, more empowered, more independent, but also more connected? Are pretty good markers of whether we're achieving that.
Yeah, that's I think that's pretty much the way things are starting to go now. Those discussions around how we allow our communities and the people who are using services and involved in services actually co-create what the things that should be supporting them. So it makes absolute sense. I often wonder how we got into a situation where, you know, what we're doing is caring, it's innately personal, and yet it's become so bureaucratic. And, you know, like you mentioned, the institutions, it's so separate from what you would instinctively think should be caring. And then, you know, the idea of having to break it down almost to the very basics. Um, I mean, do you have any view on why the system has become so corporate in that way?
So in the book, I trace it right back to the origins of public services and say we have always separated people into two groups: the people who need support and the people who don't need support. And if you're in the group who don't need support, you're treated as a citizen. You're free to do what you want. You might not always be able to get the help you need when you need it. If you're in the group who are seen as having a long-term support need, we've always asked people to give up some of their citizenship in order to get the help that they need. You know, so that's most obvious when somebody has to move out of their home and community and go somewhere else. But
Right.
it can happen in many other ways as well, around you know, eligibility assessments, risk assessments, all of that rigmarole. So I think we've always done it. I don't think it's a new thing. I don't think it's just about austerity, although that has exacerbated that divide in some ways. And I think that the work that you and others are doing around co-production is actually a big part of breaking that down. We need this to have as a core belief within our public services, that they, for me, they should be designed by two, or co-designed with two really important groups of people. So the people who make most use of those services, and then the people most likely to miss out on those services or be excluded from them. Because if we start to get our public service design right on equalities, for people from Black and minority ethnic communities, LGBT communities, for groups that have historically been excluded from our services, and certainly from the power and the discussions about what those services look like, then I think we'll actually be getting it right for everyone. But there is a key thing here about power, which is something that people are often very reluctant to talk about.
In what way do you mean by power? What is the issue with power? Is it certain people having the power? Is it the medical profession? Is this kind of medical model versus social model, or is it something else you're referring
Yeah, I
to?
mean, but both of those, and I mean, so to come back to your question about why are we behaving in this way? So you take caring people, you know, people who come into, whether it's social care, health, a public service, because they want to help people, and then suddenly they sort of find themselves increasingly drawn into a system which can almost feel like it's designed for them not to be able to behave in those ways, because they're in a rush, they're under pressure to see as many people as possible. They've got a lot of rules around what they can do. And some of the answer to that, I think, is about scale. So models like ours are always challenged to scale up. I think you touched on something a moment ago around the idea that actually we're trying to scale things back down again. And there's been a sort of a logic to the idea that if you've got a whole population, the NHS is a national health service, you've got to think at a very big scale. But then the problem with thinking at a very big scale is you lose the humanity. So I think what we're often trying to do is to be able to think about really large groups of people, but not to do that in a traditional pyramid power structure where a
Right.
very small group of not very diverse people make all the decisions and everybody else has to deal with them. We're looking for ways in which you can have some consistency around the principles. Is this a service that's giving people a good life, that's good on equalities, that's co-produced, and so on? But actually, the mechanisms, the power, and some of that power comes in the form of money, is devolved down to the most individual, family, community level possible.
Yeah. And I think that's a good way of thinking about what are the barriers sometimes to giving that community support. Um, and I know within social care generally, there's sometimes some issues around what providers might want to provide and what, say, the regulator says they need to evidence. And I don't know whether obviously the great stats around 98% are rated by the CQC as either good or outstanding. That's fantastic. But do you ever get instances where just what, because you talked about how the fact that we want to be risk averse can actually make things more risky. I thought it'd be nice to kind of discuss a little bit more what you meant by that. And also maybe connected is how our other type of responsibilities being regulated by CQC might prevent people doing what they want to do because they're having to think they're being accountable to bureaucracy, basically, in a system that's not necessarily designed around putting the person in the centre.
Yes, I think some of the ways in which regulation has impacted on the sector have not always had the desired impact. What is worth Shared Lives is an interesting model though, because it's a model of regulation which works really well. So, and it works well because the sector and the regulator have designed it together in recent
Okay.
years. There have been times when it worked really badly, and there was a really poor fit between the regulators' expectations and what people were trying to do. But if you get that fit right, for me, I'm not somebody who thinks you we need to do away with all services, all infrastructure, with regulation, and it be
Mm,
entirely all about kind of individual choice and what happens in communities. Because I think we do need that infrastructure, but it needs to work in a more human way. And as I say, there's an example here of that being possible. And I'm also aware of the regulator doing work with some of the new emerging home care providers, the services which are trying to act as brokers, do organise care in different ways to develop regulation that works for them. So I think there is actually a real appetite on behalf of the regulator to try and do things differently. You mentioned risk. So we do often describe big organizations as risk averse. And in the book, I argue that actually that's slightly inaccurate. What's really happening is they're very risk selective. So in other words, they're very worried about some risks, the risks that they could get sued for or that the regulator might give them a hard time for. And really blasé or even just not even really seeing some of the risks which actually matter most to people. So
mm,
if you talk to an older person about what would they be most worried about, what they'll often talk about is being lonely, being alone, for instance. And actually, if you talk to some services, they won't really identify that. The risks that they're much more concerned about are around safeguarding. What happens if my member of staff harms or neglects or abuses this person? But some of the systems you put in place around managing that risk are all about having a very tight control over, say, who goes in and out of a care environment. The tighter you make that control, the less you are having normal human contact and between the people who are using that service and people who are elsewhere in the community. So there's some really great examples, say, of care homes which have sort of turned that on its head and thought, how can we be a community hub? How can we actually get the community into this building? And people doing all sorts of things around community events, but also turning their gardens into their grounds into a community allotment, and
Yeah.
thinking, actually, how do we make that different kind of connection?
So it's all about large organizations thinking, how do we become part of the community, not just stand alone outside of it, which I think is probably the right way to go. And you did mention about evidencing how well that shared lives is doing, and then providing that data around the progress of it. And I always wonder how is it uh, how are you able to kind of collect that data? And do we generally focus too much on data at the moment? And is it more really the experiences and the stories that people have to say that we should be concentrating on, rather than collect? Because there's so much data everywhere, and all, and you can collect it and you think, okay, yeah, that's good. But what do you think is good data in terms of evidencing the scalability and the progress of the shared life scheme?
So I think we tend to measure what's easy to measure. So I do think if you look at the health sector, there is a lot of data collected. It's data about medical outcomes, and it does need broadening. And there's been some efforts to broaden about experience. What experience do I have of that service? Not just what was the medical outcome, but actually I would go further into, did this improve my life? Is really the question where
Yeah,
we want to get to. And that often seems very nebulous or so individual that it's impossible to measure. We worked with Kent University to develop an outcomes measuring approach, which is online and available to every shared lives service in the country for free now. And one of the things that they can keep track of is, how many friends does this person have? So is this, coming back to that point about connection being a really key indicator of a good life?
yeah,
Is this person building more friendships, or are their friendship networks dwindling? Um, that's actually something that you can, with that person's permission, kind of ask them about, and
yeah,
get some sense of. Um, so I think what are often described as the sort of the softer outcomes, we can actually think of imaginative ways of starting to measure them alongside the more medical or the more processy outcomes. And if we do that, then I think actually data is incredibly powerful. But the danger is if the power of data will just be around the particular data sets that we have, which may not actually take us in the direction that we need to
yeah.
go.
And maybe that's coming back to your point about doing things more co-productively and getting people involved to find out, okay, what data, if you were trying to find out the impacts of shared lives or any system, what data would you feel is important to measure? And that piece about co-creating these solutions with people who are affected by the system. Um, and in terms of shared lives, and you're obviously well up on helping people do things from the ground up and get involved in what's happening. Is there anything that Shared Lives is doing to help people who are using the schemes to co-develop or co-create some of the strategies, policies going forward?
So we've got a long way to go on that journey, but one of the things that's made a real difference to us as an organisation, and I think as a sector, has been employing a group of people with lived experience,
Mm.
who have learning disabilities, mental ill health, or other experience of using shared life services, who work with us very part-time, but they work with us on both speaking about the model, the ambassadorial side of it, but also they've developed something called the ambassadors test, which is, what does good shared lives look like from their perspective, which we are encouraging all of the shared life services to use as a local framework for discussion with people who use the service and their families. And we do health checks of local services, and people with lived experience are part of that team as well. So we try and get that kind of 360-degree idea of what this service is achieving and what it feels like to use it in an area.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we've come to the part of the interview when we'll go on to our cactus questions. So I don't know if you know what our cactus questions are, but we haven't got our cactus in front of us. But when we do interviews with people in the office, we usually have a cactus on the table. It's basically prickly questions about health and social care. I haven't got a huge amount of prickly ones for you, but one I thought might be a bit of a prickly one is, could people argue that shared lives is just a way for somebody to make money?
Well, shared life carers are paid, so they're not volunteers. Their friends and families get involved in an entirely informal way. But I think if you were to look at the amount the shared life carers get paid, you'd say there are there are a lot easier ways to make money. It's not by any means the best paid role, even within the care sector, although there is there's a good tax break and tax regime around it, so you can make a comfortable living, and I think that's right. I think we should value caring roles. I think one of the things that Shared Lives does quite well is it's the local organisation that's paying the shared life care and not the individual, which means that issue of it keeps that money out of that household family relationship, which feels quite important to the model, so that it is managed and overseen by the local shared lives organisation. So
Yeah.
yes, people do make do make a living out of it. You're not going to get rich becoming a shared life carer.
Yeah, and I think also a reason I thought about that question is someone posed it for fostering, and they said, "Oh, foster parents or that fosterers, they're just there to make money." When actually, when you look at what they do, really good fosters will just be doing it because they want to care, they want to support someone, they want to change someone's life, and quite rightly, you should be paid for the work that you do. And generally, care and caring is sometimes undervalued in
It's not a
societies.
question people often ask of doctors, for instance, is it?
Right, exactly.
Even though doctors are much better paid,
Really good point.
we tend to take it for granted that that's a vocation, and also that it should be well paid, and we don't
Yeah.
see those two things as in conflict. I wonder if what maybe is behind that question is this idea that you can either care or you can do something for money, and those you can't do both, and yeah, I think people need to live. The relationship needs to feel real. And coming back to what I said earlier, that we don't pretend that Shared Lives is perfect. Part of our role as a national organisation, we're not just to be the cheerleader, but to challenge and to question and improve it. And I think there is a need. So there are areas where shared life carers are not paid well enough, and where the best local schemes, the shared life carers and the scheme managers. Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. They, the shared life carers and the scheme managers and the people that use that service will have a really close collaborative relationship. But I do hear sometimes from our members who are shared life carers in an area where the scheme isn't working as effectively, who will say, well, I feel like I have to, I can't question things because this is my livelihood, and they can sort of feel that dependence. So it's so important to make sure that you're able to separate out the formality and the money side of that role from the really personal relationship that people have.
Yeah. So another question from a potential skeptic could be that shared lives is potentially quite dangerous because there's no oversight of people who are living there. Is it potentially a place that undetected abuses could be carried out?
So I think that risk is there in every care setting, and it would be wrong to say no, that couldn't possibly happen. There have been instances of abuse over the 40 years of shared lives. So what I would say in terms of, if you look at shared lives in the context of social care, they have been very few and far between. the risks appear to be really well managed. So obviously, safeguarding in concerns and alerts, and the safety of a shared life service is something that the regulators
Mm.
look at very carefully, and their conclusion is it appears to be safer than other forms of regulated care. The reasons why I think it's successful in that area are partly because the services spend a lot longer recruiting people than is
Yeah.
typical within social care. So when I went to work in a residential care home, I had an interview. I think I met the people that lived there, and then they took up references and so on. And then I was I was there. I was working, and I was working in a less unsupervised way. But of course, in any service, there are times when you're not supervised.
Yeah.
So so there's a real attention to recruiting the right people. I think the matching process is really important because you get that more empowered position of both parties choosing each other.
Yeah.
And ultimately the registered manager of each shared life service is responsible for the care in each household. So they do have that regular contact. They are looking at what people are doing. They will be visiting and finding ways. And again, we do lots of work around this. How do we find ways for the individuals to have their voices heard? So at the moment, we're exploring a partnership around independent advocacy in shared
Yeah.
lives, for instance.
And I think also it's considering there's always this idea of, so if you're looking after somebody, if they're vulnerable, then you have to protect them. It's getting the balance right between having that protection and then giving them the
Mm,
autonomy to just live in the community with a family, like
yeah.
I might do if I wanted to visit somebody and live with a family that I might have just needed to have a spare room, and I'm living in a different country, for example. That it's just understanding how you need to have the right balance, and
And that's
also
protective. I was just going to say that's protective, actually. That being visible in the community and having all of those relationships,
yes.
that keeps us safe. So that's one of the reasons why some of the really distressing abuse scandals that we've seen recently, they've happened in places that are very highly regulated, but are
Yeah,
hidden from the public.
that's a really, really good point, actually. And they've been horrendous things, that thinking about the Winterbourne View and Walton Hall and others. Um, and I had another point about that, and it's
I
just
cut you off.
gone. It's fine. It probably wasn't that good anyway.
Jumped
The other thing was, which I'm asking everyone at the moment because we're in Brexit time-ish. Well, we're in election period now, but I won't ask you about the election. Um, did you think that Brexit may or may not affect shared lives at all?
I mean, it will have an impact. There are people who are using shared lives. There are some people working within shared lives who are from the EU, and I
Okay.
think there will be issues there because most, particularly for living shared lives arrangement, you need a spare room. So people tend to have been settled in communities for for a long time. There is a smaller percentage of the workforce that's migrant workers. So it may have less impact on shared lives than in some other sectors where there's a very mobile workforce. It's really hard to prepare for and to tell at the moment because there's so much uncertainty.
Yeah.
It is a concern.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much what everyone's saying. It's just like you just don't know. I just wondered whether you thought that there's a risk with shared lives of you have this fantastically homely setting, and then because the system or regulators or whoever it is a little bit risk averse, or there's a case that happens, it starts to just look a little bit more like a small care home. You know,
Yeah.
the regulations and the everything just slowly creeps up on it. How do you combat that and challenge it and just keep it as this very unique system that looks and feels and is just like any other home?
Yeah, and so you've got to the heart of, I mean, a big part of our work at Shared Lives Plus is finding that balance, and it's constantly being kind of readjusted and challenged. So because we want both that personal family life element, and we want the backup and the infrastructure of regulation.
Yeah.
And those two things are not designed necessarily to sit together, but the benefits of shared lives as a model come from trying to get the best of both of those two worlds.
Yeah.
The risks are that one or other of those worlds takes over completely, because actually if it's a completely informal arrangement, then the risks are no longer managed. If it's a complete, as you say, it could turn into a small care home, you're constantly looking for that area in between. And it's always, that's a sort of a job, I think, that will keep us busy for as long as there is a shared life sector.
Yes. Yeah.
Is trying to find that middle way.
That middle way. Brilliant. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for joining a co-produced care chat. I've really enjoyed that. Um,
So
uh,
thank you.
as if I'm new to Alex Fox, if I'm new to Shared Lives Plus, how can people get hold? We will get hold of you. We'll put stuff in the description box. But you're on Twitter, but I can't remember your
So they can,
handle.
I'm easy to find on Twitter at Alex Shared Lives,
Okay.
and the organisation at Shared Lives Plus. We have a website, so you can find, there's a map, you can find your local Shared Lives service. That's a really good place to start. So we're sharedlivesplus.org.uk.
Great.
So yeah, we're pretty easy to find, both nationally and locally,
Brilliant.
and get in touch and have a chat.
Great. And are you blogging, or where can we get hold of your book?
Yeah, so my blog is imaginatively called Alex Fox Blog,
Okay.
and
Amazing.
you can find some links to more about the book there as well. And the book's from Policy Press,
Okay.
and there's a link on my blog to the launch event at the charity Nesta.
Oh, brilliant. When's that?
Well, that's happened, so you can see
Okay.
me presenting on it. If you're not if you're not into reading, you prefer the plotted version. There's
Yeah.
me trying to take people through it in about 10 minutes flat.
Wow, that sounds really good. What we'll do, we'll put all those links in the description box at the bottom. So that's really helpful. Okay, well, thank you very much, Alex. And we're looking forward to sharing this video. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks very much.